So now that we've extensively looked through the different structures as a part of the human respiratory system, we're going to now look more specifically at the function of respiration, which would be breathing. So we'll entitle this first flowchart on that topic, Breathing 1. This is shown and summarized in figure 42.27. So let's begin. When we're talking about breathing, we're now talking about a mechanical process. A process that involves movement of things, whether they are muscles or bones, whatever it may be, things are going to move. That's why it's mechanical. And it's a mechanical process that specifically moves air, which contains oxygen, that's what we want, into and out of the lungs. Both of those, into and out of lungs. So it can't just be one or the other, it's both. This is going to be subclassified as breathing is basically two portions. It's inhalation and exhalation. So we have breathing out and breathing in. Inhalation, exhalation. So let's take a look at what that really consists of. In order to do the inhalation side of things, in order to really do breathing successfully, what mammals utilize is a negative pressure breathing system. So we'll write that down. Mammals, functionally speaking, are going to be with what is known as a negative pressure breathing system. So we'll just write negative pressure breathing. That's how we, as mammals, breathe successfully. What does this entail? This is really what figure 42.27 really tries to drive home. But basically, to put it into sort of short words, we'll state that what we notice about negative pressure breathing that's important, is that pressure in the lungs, that's interior, that's not in the external environment, pressure in our lungs is lower, it's lower than the pressure of the air that's outside the body. So we'll write that down. Air outside the body. So this is something now we have to recollect about the idea of how pressure of different substances causes movement of those gases, the partial pressure laws that we've known. So basically, because we have a lower pressure on the inside versus the outside, the end result that we get is a gas movement and gas flowing from the outside, the air environment, to the lower pressure inside environment that is within the lungs. Essentially, when you go outside to inside as a gas in regards to a circular or a respiratory system, this means you're going from an area of high pressure to an area of what is known as low pressure. External environment, internal environment. Basically, this is what allows air to be pulled in. So air is pulled in by going from a high pressure area to a low pressure area via what is termed generally as negative pressure breathing. Okay, so that's how breathing really happens. But again, we stated that there's inhalation and exhalation, so we have to look at how both of those events occur in order to promote successful breathing. So let's look first at inhalation. How do we do this process of taking air into the body? Inhalation is going to involve the rib cage. So we will utilize the rib cage, and the rib cage will define it as 12 pairs of ribs and muscles. So it's 12 pairs of ribs and also muscles that are attached to these ribs. So we're definitely utilizing these very important structural parts of respiration, known as the ribs and the muscles. So let me extend that B there. Okay, so what do we do here? What we have within this inhalation rib cage area is the external intercostal muscles. Those are some you should remember. They're called intercostal muscles. That's what's really going to be driving this inhalation process, because those are the muscles that will simultaneously contract. They will contract very strongly together, in order to then promote the lifting of the ribs upwards. Because remember, muscles are connected to bones, musculoskeletal system. So the intercostal muscles connected to those ribs at the rib cage cause the ribs to be lifted upwards because they contracted in the previous step. So the ribs are lifted upwards. Big deal. How does this change anything? Well, when the ribs are lifted upwards in an inhalatory process, this causes the following. It changes the angle of the ribs, the arrangement at which they are from their natural state, let's say, that's not contracted. That angle of the ribs changes. That basically means that the thoracic cavity, its size increases. That's the final sort of result of all of this muscle and bone movement. Overall, this increases the size of the chest, or what is otherwise known as the thoracic cavity. This is going to be good. Why is this good? We need to increase the thoracic cavity size because we're breathing in right now. We need to get as much air into the system as possible. And inhalation promotes that by making sure that the thoracic cavity is nice and big, nice and enlarged through this intercostal rib muscle arrangement steps that we saw. In addition, not only are the intercostal muscles going to be functioning in inhalation, there's also going to be the diaphragm. That's another structure you should definitely remember. Diaphragm, which is just another muscle involved in respiration, contracts as well. It contracts along with these intercostal muscles. And when the diaphragm contracts, the diaphragm itself will just shortly state that this is a domed sheet of skeletal muscle. So if it's skeletal muscle, it's connected to the skeleton. It's also voluntary. So you can control the size of your diaphragm. If you breathe in really deeply, you are going to get a very strong and a large contraction of the diaphragm. And if you breathe in very shortly, you'll get a much shorter contraction and a much smaller contraction. The diaphragm itself is attached along the lower ribs. So it's attached along the lower ribs, whereas the intercostal muscles really do a lot of their job on the upper rib portion. This is what's going to form. It forms the bottom wall of the thoracic cavity. And if you're forming the bottom wall of the thoracic cavity, you're basically forming the end of the thoracic cavity. So if you're contracting, and the goal is to make this thoracic cavity bigger, you're going to ensure that this formation of the bottom wall is done in a way so that the thoracic cavity size increases. So during diaphragm contraction, you get also, just like intercostal contraction, a larger thoracic cavity overall. That is what overall allows lots of air to enter this system. Why do we want lots of air to enter? Well, that's because we're trying to do inhalation. We're trying to bring in as much air as possible from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure, from the outside to the inside. That's what inhalation is all about. But again, breathing is two-sided. There's inhalation, that's great, but what about exhalation? Let's look at exhalation briefly over here to conclude this flowchart. In exhalation, this is much more of a passive process. It is not as involved as the inhalation process in terms of the muscles and bones activated, the increasing size of the thoracic cavity. All of this is very active. It involves a lot of things going on. Exhalation is a little bit different because it's a passive process in which there's going to be no more inhalation. So there's no more need to increase the size of anything. So we can basically go back to normal. So if there's no more inhalation, we basically get the opposite of contraction. We get the opposite of contraction at the things that were contracted. The diaphragm and the rib muscles, specifically the intercostal muscles, both of them relax. So the rib muscles relax, the diaphragm relax. That gives everything back to its resting, or puts everything back into its resting position. So we'll write that down. Everything back to resting position. So it's much easier to get back to resting position than it is to be in a contracted, larger thoracic cavity size state. Therefore, we consider exhalation a more passive process. Overall, what we need to understand about these steps is that the thoracic cavity in this regard decreases in size. Thoracic cavity will state decreases. It decreases in its size as compared to the inhalation process, and that basically is because air is now rushing out. So in order to promote the rushing out of air, why not make the area at which it was originally confined much, much smaller through exhalation, through these relaxation of muscles? Now, sort of a fun fact to note is that in birds, during their exhalation, they actually don't undergo a passive process. Their exhalation is not passive at all. It's not passive because during their exhalation, because exhalation for them actually can occur as inhalation occurs. So it happens at the same time. So that's something that's unique to birds as inhalation occurs. You might be wondering, well, why do they do this? Well, this is because birds are very, very metabolically active organisms that are constantly moving, doing something that's constantly involved like flight. So they need even more air pushed in and out at a faster rate, and they don't utilize as much of a passive exhalation as most mammals do. So that covers our initial look at breathing. We now understand the two parts, inhalation and exhalation. Next, we're going to be looking at specifically what's going on in the lungs in terms of breathing.